You ever have that feeling like you're the only sane person in a world gone utterly spectacularly mad? That was me a few years back, standing in the doorway of one of my own storage units, a unit I knew was empty, staring at a jumbled mess of other people's belongings. Golf clubs, deflated Santas, what looked suspiciously like a complete set of someone's ceramic cat collection. And the HOA next door, when I finally tracked down the source of this unsolicited interior decorating? Their president, a woman who wielded her clipboard like a royal scepter, essentially told me to get over it. Oh, I got over it, all right. I got over it in a way she, and the entire HOA, would remember for a very, very long time. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because trust me, you're going to want to hear how this particular episode of Suburban Warfare played out. This story isn't just about storage units. It's about principle, it's about audacity, and it's about the glorious, meticulous, and entirely legal dismantling of a petty tyrant's little fiefdom. My name is Arthur Henderson, and by trade, I'm a retired civil engineer. I like things to be precise, orderly, and above all, fair. When I bought a small commercial plaza on the edge of town, it came with a block of 20 self-storage units at the back of the property. They weren't the primary reason for the purchase, but I figured, why not? A bit of passive income, keep them clean, keep them secure, simple. I managed them myself. I knew every tenant, every unit status. Unit 17 had been vacant for 3 months, swept clean, lock-checked. Or so I thought. I was doing my monthly walkthrough, just a visual check of the lanes, making sure everything looked secure, when I noticed Unit 17 had a brand new, rather expensive-looking padlock on it. Not my standard issue. My heart did a little thump of irritation. Had I forgotten a new rental? Unlikely. I keep meticulous records. A quick check of my ledger confirmed it. Unit 17, still listed as vacant. No lease, no deposit, no tenant named mystery occupant. My first thought was a squatter, but this was a secure, gated facility. Well, secure-ish, the gate was more of a deterrent than a fortress. I put a polite but firm notice on the unit. This unit appears to be occupied without a valid lease agreement. Please contact Arthur Henderson at my phone number immediately to rectify this situation or remove your belongings. I gave it 48 hours, nothing, no call. The lock remained. My irritation was graduating to suspicion. This felt less like a desperate individual seeking shelter and more like something else. Something entitled. I decided a bit more observation was in order. I have a couple of game cameras I use for tracking deer on a friend's property, so I discreetly mounted one with a view of Unit 17's door. It wasn't long before I got my answer. The footage showed a woman, coiffed blonde hair sprayed into an immovable helmet, struggling to maneuver a large ornate birdbath into the unit. She was followed by a man in a polo shirt tucked tightly into khaki shorts, carrying what looked like judging paraphernalia, ribbons, a small PA system. I recognized them. The woman was Carol Albright, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, the sprawling development that bordered my property to the east. The man was her perpetually flustered vice president, Gary. Willow Creek Estates, an entity I'd had minimal, though occasionally perplexing, dealings with. Mostly requests for me to trim trees they claimed were encroaching from my side, even when my property survey clearly showed they were well within my bounds. Carol Albright, in particular, was a woman who seemed to believe her HOA presidency granted her dominion over a far wider territory than the HOA bylaws stipulated. She drove a gleaming white Cadillac Escalade, the kind that takes up 1.5 parking spaces, and always wore an expression that suggested she'd just smelled something unpleasant, which, in her vicinity, was often her own overpoweringly floral perfume. So, it was her. This wasn't a squatter, this was an invasion. A deliberate, unauthorized occupation by an organized body that should damn well know better. My irritation flared into a hot poker of anger. This wasn't just an oversight, this was arrogance. The kind of arrogance that assumes rules are for other people. The kind of arrogance that was about to meet a very methodical, very patient, and increasingly ticked-off civil engineer. I saved the footage, a small, satisfied smile playing on my lips. This was just the beginning. Carol Albright had no idea who she was dealing with. She saw a quiet, older guy who owned some storage units. She didn't see the man who had successfully navigated complex county zoning variances, battled recalcitrant contractors, and understood the power of well-documented facts. Oh, she was about to learn. I decided to approach this calmly, at first. Give her a chance to backtrack, to realize her mistake. I walked over to the Willow Creek Community Clubhouse the next afternoon, a rather ostentatious building that always seemed to be undergoing some form of improvement. Carol was there naturally, overseeing the placement of some new, aggressively cheerful welcome mat. Miss Albright, I began, keeping my voice even. I believe there's been a misunderstanding regarding Unit 17 at my storage facility. She turned, her eyes doing that slow blink that some people use to convey utter disinterest. Mr. Henderson, isn't it? From the place next door. The way she said place made it sound like I was running a disreputable scrapyard. Yes, I said. Unit 17 is currently occupied by items I believe belong to the HOA, yet there's no lease agreement in place. Her perfectly plucked eyebrows rose a fraction. Oh, that. Yes, Gary handled that. We needed a bit of overflow space for the upcoming fall festival decorations and some of the pool equipment. It's just temporary. Just temporary. As if that excused anything. Temporary or not, Miss Albright, it's my property. Use of a unit requires a lease and payment. She actually tittered. A short, sharp sound like a startled bird. Surely, Mr. Henderson, you can spare one little unit for the good of the community. It's practically empty otherwise. We're all neighbors here. Neighbors. Funny how that term only seemed to apply when she wanted something. The good of your community, miss. Albright doesn't extend to the unauthorized use of my private property. I need the unit cleared or a formal lease signed at the standard rate. Her smile vanished, replaced by a chilly mask. Well, I'm afraid we're rather busy with festival preparations. The items will be removed when we have the time. Perhaps you could be a little more community-minded. The condescension was palpable. She turned back to the welcome mat, a clear dismissal. It was then I knew this wouldn't be resolved with a polite conversation. This was a declaration of intent. She genuinely believed she had the right. My jaw tightened. Community-minded? Oh, I was about to become very community-minded, just not in the way she expected. I walked away, the game camera footage replaying in my mind. She had just handed me the rope. Now I just needed to let her have enough of it. My engineering brain was already shifting gears from polite inquiry to strategic planning. This wasn't just about a storage unit anymore. This was about principle. My next step was to formalize everything. Verbal discussions with someone like Carol Albright were clearly a waste of breath and an invitation for misinterpretation. I drafted a polite but unequivocal letter addressed to the Willow Creek Estates HOA Board of Directors, care of Miss Carol Albright, President. I outlined the situation, the unauthorized occupation of Unit 17, the date I discovered it, and the photographic evidence I possessed of HOA representatives accessing the unit. I stated clearly that they had two options: either remove all HOA property from Unit 17 within 10 business days of the date of the letter, or sign a standard monthly lease agreement at the going rate of $150 per month, backdated to the estimated date of first occupation, which my camera footage conveniently provided. I also included a copy of my standard lease agreement for their perusal. I sent this letter via certified mail with return receipt requested, and also via email to the official HOA address listed on their website, ensuring a digital paper trail. I even hand-delivered a copy to the clubhouse mailbox, just for good measure. Overkill? Perhaps. But I've learned in my years that when dealing with difficult people or entities, there's no such thing as too much documentation. Every step needed to be provable, every communication logged. A week later, the green certified mail card came back, signed with a flamboyant flourish that could only be Carol's. The email was marked as read. Silence. Then, on the 9th business day, a letter arrived. Not from the full board, but on HOA letterhead, signed solely by Carol Albright, President. It was a masterpiece of dismissive arrogance. She acknowledged my correspondence and stated that the HOA board had discussed the matter. I doubted that very much. It was more likely Carol had simply informed them of her unilateral decision and had graciously decided to offer me $25 a month for the temporary and infrequent use of the unit. as a gesture of goodwill for neighborhood harmony. She added a patronizing little sentence. We trust this resolves your concerns and fosters a more cooperative spirit between our properties. Cooperative spirit. My teeth ground together. This wasn't cooperation. This was a calculated insult, a power play. She genuinely believed she could dictate terms on my own land. The audacity was breathtaking. It was clear she hadn't taken my deadline seriously, nor the implication that there would be consequences. In fact, my game camera, which I'd left active, showed increased activity. Not only was Unit 17 now visibly bulging, but I saw Gary, looking even more flustered than usual, tentatively trying the lock on Unit 18, which was also vacant. He didn't get in, as I use high-security locks I install myself, but the intent was clear. They weren't just using one unit, they were eyeing expansion. This escalation, however, played right into my hands. Her dismissive letter was now Exhibit B in my growing file. I didn't even bother responding to her insulting offer. Instead, I began the next phase of my plan. My patience was a strategic tool, not a sign of weakness, something Carol Albright clearly mistook it for. I let another week pass, just to ensure there was no ambiguity about her ignoring my reasonable terms. Then, I drafted a second letter. This one was less polite, more formal. It was a final notice before action. I referenced her letter, reiterated that her offer was unacceptable, and stated that if all HOA property was not removed from Unit 17 and any other units they might have surreptitiously occupied, I was covering my bases within 7 calendar days, and if a lease for the full amount, including back rent, was not signed and payment remitted, I would be forced to consider all items within the units as abandoned property. I then clearly cited the relevant state statutes regarding the disposal of abandoned property in self-storage facilities, which typically involve a public auction. I made sure the language was precise, legally sound, and left no room for misunderstanding. Again, certified mail, return receipt, email with read receipt, and a hand-delivered copy. This time, I also included a clear photograph of the overstuffed Unit 17, date stamped by the game camera. Let her see I wasn't bluffing about evidence. During this period, I continued my quiet surveillance. The sheer variety of items crammed into Unit 17 was astonishing. Besides the fall festival paraphernalia and pool cleaning equipment, I could now glimpse through a slightly ajar door. They weren't even careful about closing it properly. What looked like several sets of golf clubs, very expensive ones by the look of the bags, a high-end gas grill, numerous boxes labeled holiday decorations, President's House, and even a stack of what appeared to be old campaign signs from Carol's last HOA election. The President's House label was particularly interesting. Were these truly community items, or was Carol using my facility as her personal free attic? The suspicion began to solidify. This wasn't just HOA overreach. This might be personal benefit disguised as community need. My resolve hardened. This was no longer just about retrieving my unit. It was about exposing this blatant abuse of power. The 7-day deadline on my final notice approached. On the 6th day, I received an email directly from Carol. No letterhead this time, just a short, sharp message. Mr. Henderson, your continued harassment is uncalled for. The HOA is a non-profit organization, and we are very busy serving our residents. We will address the storage matter when the festival is over. Your threats are duly noted and considered highly unneighborly. Unneighborly. That was rich. The sheer, unadulterated gall. She was still treating me like a minor annoyance, a gnat to be swatted away when convenient. She clearly didn't believe I'd follow through. People like Carol Albright operate on bullying and intimidation. They rarely expect methodical, legally compliant resistance. They expect you to get angry, yell, and then eventually give up. They don't expect you to read the fine print and use it against them. The deadline passed. Silence. Perfect. I picked up the phone and called a lawyer I'd used a few years back for a property line dispute. A sharp fellow named Ben Carter who specialized in real estate and contract law. I laid out the whole story, sent him copies of all correspondence, the photos, the video stills. He listened patiently. When I was done, there was a pause, then a low chuckle on the other end of the line. Arthur, he said, this woman sounds like a classic case. But from what you've told me and the documentation you've got, you're in a very strong position. State law is quite clear on this. You've given them every opportunity. He confirmed the steps I needed to take for a legal auction of abandoned property, specific wording for the public notice, how many times and where it needed to be published, the notice that needed to be posted on the unit itself. Follow this to the letter, Arthur, Ben advised, and she won't have a leg to stand on. In fact, she might find herself in quite a bit of hot water with her own HOA members when they find out what she's been up to. That last part was music to my ears. The game was truly afoot. The next morning, I had a formal notice of lien and intent to sell property professionally printed. It detailed the tenant as Willow Creek Estates HOA, CO, Carol Albright, President, the unit number 17, the outstanding rent, calculated at my standard rate for the duration of their unauthorized occupancy, plus late fees as per my standard, unagreed upon but now being enforced lease terms, and a clear statement that if the full amount was not paid and the property claimed within 15 days, the contents of Unit 17 would be sold at public auction to satisfy the lien. The notice listed the date, time, and location of the auction. My facility, 3 weeks hence, a Saturday morning. I posted one prominently on the door of Unit 17. I sent copies yet again via certified mail and email to Carol and the HOA. Then, I took out advertisements in the local paper and on a couple of online classified sites, exactly as prescribed by state law and Ben's counsel. The ads were dry, factual. Public sale of abandoned property, Unit 17, my facility name and address, date, time. Contents appear to include holiday decorations, sporting goods, household items, etc. Sold as is, where is, to the highest bidder. Cash only. I even took a photo of the notice posted on Unit 17 with the bulging contents visible behind it just for my records. I imagined Carol seeing the newspaper ad. She'd probably scoff, maybe even laugh, convinced it was an elaborate bluff. He wouldn't dare. She'd likely tell her cronies, perhaps Gary, who by now probably had a permanent facial tic from the stress of enabling her. But I would dare. I was daring. And I was meticulously, legally, and rather gleefully daring. The countdown to auction day had begun. Every legal I was dotted, every T crossed. Carol Albright thought she was playing checkers with a fool. She was about to discover she was in a chess match with an engineer who had just maneuvered her queen into a fatal trap. The beauty of it was, she was doing most of the work herself, through her own breathtaking arrogance. Auction day dawned bright and clear, a perfect Saturday morning. I'd hired a professional auctioneer, a no-nonsense fellow named Mike, who'd done this sort of thing 1,000 times. He arrived early, took a look at Unit 17. I'd cut Carol's expensive lock-off that morning, replacing it with one of my own, the key to which Mike now held, and whistled. "Quite the collection in there, Art," he said, peering in. "Looks like a suburban garage exploded." I'd set up a small table for registration and payment, and a few folding chairs, though I didn't expect a huge crowd. These small-time storage auctions usually drew a handful of local resellers, curious neighbors, and people hoping to find a hidden treasure. By 9:45 a.m., about 15 minutes before the scheduled 10 a.m. start, a motley group of about 20 people had gathered. A few familiar faces from the neighborhood, not the HOA side, notably, a couple of guys with pickup trucks who looked like they frequented auctions, and one or two women who seemed to be there purely for the spectacle. I was feeling a calm sense of anticipation. Everything was in place. And then, at precisely 9:53 a.m., a gleaming white Cadillac Escalade screeched to a halt at the entrance to the storage facility, horn blaring. Carol Albright emerged, resplendent in a bright pink pantsuit that did little to soften her furious expression. Flanking her were Gary, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, and another woman I recognized as the HOA treasurer, a thin, nervous-looking individual named Doris. "Henderson!" Carol bellowed, marching towards me, her voice echoing across the asphalt. "What is the meaning of this outrage? You cannot sell our property. This is theft!" Her face was mottled with anger, the blonde helmet looking particularly rigid. The small crowd of auction-goers turned, intrigued. This was shaping up to be more entertaining than they'd anticipated. I remained perfectly calm. I even managed a polite, if slightly cool, smile. "Miss Albright, good morning. As per the multiple legal notices served to you and the HOA, And the public advertisements. This is a lawful auction to recover unpaid rent and fees for the unauthorized use of my storage unit. I held up a folder. I have copies of all relevant documentation right here. The certified mail receipts, the published notices, the photographs, our prior correspondence. You were given ample opportunity to remove your association's belongings or to enter into a formal lease agreement. You chose to do neither. Carol sputtered. Documentation? This is harassment. Those items are vital to our community. You can't just sell them. Gary, to his credit, tried to intervene. Carol, maybe we should have just paid the man. She shot him a look that could curdle milk. Silence, Gary. This is a matter of principle. Principle. She was still clinging to that. The auctioneer Mike stepped forward. Ma'am, if you have proof of payment or a current lease, we can certainly halt the proceedings. Otherwise, Mr. Henderson is within his rights. Carol glared at him. And who are you? Mike Roston, licensed auctioneer, and we're scheduled to start in 2 minutes. She looked wildly around, as if seeking an ally in the crowd. Finding only curious and somewhat amused faces, her fury intensified. I'm calling the police. This is illegal. She fumbled for her phone. Please do, Miss Albright. I said calmly, I'd be happy to explain the situation to them as well. True to her word, she jabbed at her phone, her voice rising histrionically as she described the theft in progress. While she was thus occupied, Mike winked at me and announced, All right, folks, 10 o'clock. Let's get started with Unit 17. He unlatched the door and rolled it up with a clatter, revealing the chaotic bounty within. There were gasps, then murmurs from the crowd. It really was an eclectic mix. Holiday decorations, dozens of boxes, sporting goods, those expensive golf clubs, a couple of decent bicycles, tennis rackets, the infamous bird bath, the PA system, stacks of files that probably contained HOA business, now about to be scattered to the winds. And, tucked in a corner, clearly visible, were the boxes explicitly labeled Holiday Decorations, President's House. I made sure to glance towards Carol as Mike pointed those out. Her face, if possible, got even redder. The bidding started. Mike was good, coaxing bids for individual items and small lots. A set of slightly used Christmas lights went for $5. A box of bewildered-looking ceramic squirrels fetched $10. The high-end gas grill, after some spirited bidding between two resellers, went for a very respectable $250. The golf clubs, which Carol kept shrieking, were irreplaceable custom clubs belonging to a respected member, were snapped up for $400 by a man who looked like he knew his Titleists from his Callaways. Each sale was like a small hammer blow to Carol's composure. She paced, she fumed, she made loud pronouncements about suing me into oblivion. The police did arrive, two calm officers who listened patiently to Carol's tirade, then to my quiet explanation, accompanied by my folder of evidence. One of them, Officer Miller, whom I knew vaguely from a neighborhood watch meeting years ago, reviewed my paperwork. He nodded. Ma'am? He said to Carol, As far as we can see, Mr. Henderson has followed all the legal procedures for an abandoned property auction. This is a civil matter. We can't intervene unless there's a breach of the peace. Carol looked aghast. Breach of the peace? He's breaching the peace by stealing our property. Officer Miller just gave her a level look. You'll need to take that up with the courts, ma'am. For now, this auction is proceeding legally. He and his partner then advised Carol to keep her voice down and not interfere, or she might be the one breaching the peace. That shut her up momentarily, though she continued to glare daggers at everyone involved. The public humiliation was clearly a novel and unpleasant experience for her. The auction continued for another hour. The boxes labeled President's House were particularly interesting. They contained not just holiday items, but also what looked like personal knickknacks, old photo albums, and even a collection of rather garish porcelain dolls. These didn't fetch much, but the symbolic victory of seeing Carol Albright's personal hoard being sold off for pennies on the dollar was immense. Gary and Doris, the treasurer, looked increasingly miserable, clearly wishing the earth would swallow them. Finally, the last item was sold. The unit was empty, save for a few dust bunnies and a lingering scent of Carol's outrage. Mike tallied up the proceeds. After deducting my calculated back rent, at $150 a month for the 4 months they'd occupied it, plus the legally stipulated late fees, the cost of the advertisements, and Mike's commission, there was actually a surplus of a few $100s. As per the law, this surplus legally belonged to the defaulting tenant, the HOA. I had Mike prepare a formal receipt and a check for the surplus amount, payable to Willow Creek Estates HOA. I walked over to where Carol was still simmering, flanked by her dejected lieutenants. "Miss Albright," I said, holding out the check and receipt. "Here is the remaining balance from the auction proceeds, after all outstanding debts and costs were settled. Please ensure this is appropriately recorded in the HOA's accounts." She stared at the check, as if it were a venomous snake. She didn't take it. Doris, the treasurer, however, hesitantly reached out and accepted it, murmuring a barely audible "thank you." Carol just spun on her heel and stalked back to her Escalade, Gary scurrying after her. As she wrenched open the car door, she shot back one last venomous glare. "You will regret this, Henderson. You will regret this more than anything you've ever done." I just smiled faintly. Somehow, I doubted that. The buyers were happily loading their newfound treasures. My unit was empty. I had my money, and I had a feeling the real show was just beginning. I immediately went and installed a brand new, even more robust lock on Unit 17, and then on Unit 18 for good measure. The sense of satisfaction was profound. It took less than a week for the official-looking envelope to arrive. Summons and complaint: Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association versus Arthur Henderson. They were suing me for unlawful seizure and sale of HOA property, conversion, which is a legal term for wrongfully taking someone else's property, trespass, presumably for entering their unit to conduct the auction, and a host of other trumped-up charges. They were seeking damages that were, to put it mildly, imaginative, claiming the contents of the unit were worth tens of thousands of dollars, including irreplaceable community artifacts and items of significant sentimental value. Carol Albright was clearly not one to admit defeat gracefully. She was doubling down, hoping to bury me in legal fees and bully me into submission. She had, once again, severely underestimated her opponent. I immediately called Ben Carter, my lawyer. "Well, Arthur," he said, after I emailed him the documents, "can't say I'm surprised. People like her hate to lose, especially publicly. But they've just walked into a minefield." Ben was positively gleeful. "This isn't a problem, Arthur. This is an opportunity. The discovery process on this is going to be very, very interesting." Our defense was straightforward. We had meticulously followed every letter of the state law regarding abandoned property and self-storage facilities. We filed our answer, denying all their claims and attaching copies of every piece of documentation I had accumulated: the letters, the certified mail receipts, the photographs, the video stills of Carol and Gary stalking the unit, the public notices of the auctioneer's full accounting, even the check for the surplus proceeds that Doris had accepted. Ben also filed a counterclaim for attorney's fees, citing the frivolous nature of their lawsuit. Then came discovery. This is the phase of a lawsuit where both sides get to request information and documents from the other and conduct depositions sworn out-of-court testimony. And this, as Ben predicted, was where Carol Albright's carefully constructed facade began to crumble spectacularly. Ben sent a comprehensive request for documents to the HOA, seeking all board meeting minutes pertaining to the storage unit, all internal communications about it, any inventories of the items stored, and detailed financial records showing the purchase and ownership of the allegedly valuable items. He also scheduled depositions for Carol Albright, Gary, and Doris, the treasurer. The initial document dump from the HOA was telling in its omissions. There were no official board meeting minutes authorizing the use of my storage unit, no formal votes, just vague references in Carol's President's Report section about securing temporary storage for festival items. When Ben pressed for inventories or proof of purchase for the high-value items they claimed, they produced very little. A few faded receipts for some plastic tables and the PA system, nothing for the expensive golf clubs or the high-end grill. Doris, the treasurer, was the first to be deposed. She was a bundle of nerves. Under Ben's calm but persistent questioning, she admitted that Carol had simply told the board she had made an arrangement for storage. Doris confessed she'd had misgivings, but didn't want to challenge Carol. She also admitted that many of the holiday decorations boxes were, to her knowledge, items Carol brought from her own home each year for the clubhouse, and then took back. She had no idea who owned the golf clubs, but she'd seen Carol's husband using a similar set. Gary's deposition was even more revealing. He was clearly terrified of Carol, but also tired of being her scapegoat. He admitted Carol had instructed him to find someplace cheap or free for the items, because the HOA's own small storage shed was full, largely, he sheepishly admitted, with things Carol had deemed too important to discard but didn't want at her own house. He confirmed Carol had dismissed my letters out of hand, calling me a grasping old man. He also, crucially, admitted that when he'd seen my final notice before action, he had urged Carol to just pay the rental fee, but she had refused, saying, "He won't dare do anything. We're the HOA. He needs us more than we need him." But the real fireworks were Carol Albright's deposition. She swept in with her lawyer, a slick, overly confident man who clearly thought this was a minor nuisance case. Carol was arrogant, combative, and repeatedly tried to dodge questions. Ben, however, was like a patient bulldog. He'd circle back, rephrase, and calmly pin her down. The turning point came when Ben produced enlarged, date-stamped photos from my game camera showing Carol herself, not HOA volunteers. Loading boxes clearly labeled Personal CA Xmas and Attic Overflow Albright into Unit 17. Her lawyer tried to object, but the judge had already ruled them admissible. Carol's face went pale under her usual layer of foundation. Those are items I lend to the community for events," she stammered. Ben then produced the auctioneer's detailed inventory list, cross-referencing items sold with those very labels. "So, Miss Albright," Ben asked gently, "these personal items that you lent to the community, you are now suing Mr. Henderson for their value on behalf of the HOA, claiming they were HOA property?" She floundered, trying to bluster her way out, but the damage was done. It became abundantly clear that a significant portion of the items stored in my unit, for which she was now suing me using HOA funds, were her own personal belongings she was storing for free. This wasn't just unauthorized use, this was potential misuse of HOA funds and a breach of her fiduciary duty. The smoking gun wasn't just one piece of evidence, but a whole barrage, culminating in her own damning admissions and the clear photographic proof. News of the depositions, particularly the revelations about Carol's personal items, started to leak out among the Willow Creek Estates residents. People who had blindly trusted her, or been too intimidated to question her, were suddenly finding their voices. The HOA's next community meeting, I heard later, was quite a lively affair, with residents demanding answers about the lawsuit, the legal fees, and exactly whose property had been auctioned off. The ground was definitely shifting under Carol Albright's expensive, probably HOA-subsidized, shoes. The fallout from the depositions was swift and brutal for Carol Albright. Her lawyer, the slick fellow who had probably assured her this was a slam-dunk case, suddenly became much more amenable to discussing a settlement. Ben Carter, my lawyer, was firm. "Arthur isn't paying a dime," he told them. "In fact, your client is going to drop this baseless lawsuit with prejudice, meaning she can never bring it again, and the HOA is going to pay Mr. Henderson's full legal fees. Otherwise, we proceed to summary judgment, and I can assure you the judge will not be amused by misplace." Albright's abuse of the legal process and her apparent self-dealing. The HOA's lawyer must have seen the writing on the wall because within a week they capitulated. The lawsuit was dropped. The HOA, after a very contentious emergency board meeting where Carol was reportedly raked over the coals by newly emboldened board members and a gallery of angry homeowners, cut a check for my legal expenses. It wasn't a king's ransom, but it covered every penny Ben had billed me, plus a little extra for my time and trouble, which Ben had cleverly negotiated as administrative costs incurred due to frivolous litigation. But Carol's troubles were far from over. The revelations from the discovery process had opened Pandora's box within Willow Creek Estates. Homeowners, now armed with facts instead of just suspicions, demanded a full audit of the HOA's finances and Carol's activities during her presidency. Several residents, whose donated items for community events had mysteriously ended up in Unit 17 and subsequently auctioned, were furious. It turned out Carol had been using the HOA as her personal moving and storage service for years, not just with my facility, but in other subtle ways, always under the guise of community benefit. The audit, when it was finally completed by an independent firm, uncovered numerous irregularities. Questionable expenses, contracts awarded to friends without competitive bids, and, of course, the whole debacle with my storage unit, where she had clearly misrepresented the situation to the board and then used HOA funds to pursue a personal vendetta through the lawsuit. The massive fines from the original prompt didn't come from a court in my case directly, but the consequences for Carol were financially and reputationally devastating. The new HOA board, once elected after Carol was unceremoniously ousted in a special vote of no confidence, took legal action against her to recoup the misspent legal fees for the lawsuit against me, the value of HOA property lost due to her negligence, and even the rent they had to pay me via the auction proceeds, for the unit she had essentially commandeered for her personal junk. They also reported her to some state oversight body for homeowners associations, citing breach of fiduciary duty, which I heard later resulted in significant personal penalties for her. She was, in effect, fined by the very community she had lorded it over. My life returned to its peaceful, orderly state. Unit 17, and indeed all my units, remained securely leased to legitimate paying tenants. I upgraded my facility's main gate to a more robust system, just in case, though the new Willow Creek HOA board proved to be reasonable and refreshingly drama-free. Their new president, a quiet accountant named David, actually came over to personally apologize for the whole affair, shaking my head and remarking, "Some people just can't handle a little bit of power, can they?" I just smiled. "No, David, some people can't." Carol Albright, I heard, sold her house in Willow Creek Estates, at a loss, rumor had it, due to the scandal tainting the neighborhood's reputation temporarily, and moved out of state. Her white Escalade was no longer a fixture in the area, and the local air quality improved slightly from the reduced concentration of her aggressive floral perfume. Looking back, it was a ridiculous amount of stress and effort over one storage unit. But it was never just about the unit, was it? It was about standing up to a bully, about the principle that you can't just take what isn't yours, no matter how important you think you are. My meticulous record-keeping, my insistence on following legal procedures to the letter, and a good lawyer, those were my weapons. And they proved far more effective than Carol Albright's bluster and entitlement. It just goes to show sometimes the quiet, methodical approach is the most powerful one. So that's the story of how I ended up auctioning off an HOA president's personal belongings and inadvertently causing a revolution in the neighborhood next door. It was, as they say, a wild ride. And you know, for a while there, I probably did hold the world record for the most legally sound, thoroughly documented, and ultimately satisfying eviction of a rogue HOA's junk. Hit that like button if you think Carol got what she deserved, and subscribe for more tales from the front lines of property ownership. You never know what kind of crazy is just around the corner.